you know, like here we go, not these other times where we weren't actually going yet. Just this for real.
We're going for real this time.
The for real going. Yes.
Awesome. Yeah. Hi everybody.
We got a few people joining in. We got a lot of folks coming from all of the different. Sure, we've got all of our audio and video going as it ought to. There it is.
We're live.
Hey, we're live. It's working. We're live.
Yeah.
So, all right. Well, welcome to another Unauthorized Caucus. It's Thursday. It's noon. So it's time to do caucus stuff. I just wanted to make sure we had all of our stuff going. We've had some broadcast issues the last few weeks, but we'll see. You could just call it terrible broadband in our area, or we could equate it to being hunted down.
Yeah, we can call it the CIA shooting anti-Wi-Fi space lasers.
Anti-Wi-Fi space lasers. That's true, and we can talk about them at the same time. So.
Yeah.
Never know. Bad stuff happens. But yeah, welcome to another one. We got a good one today. And there's been a lot going on, but not as much. We don't have another primary because we keep talking about that, but we don't have another primary in the Republican Party presidential race until what? February? Is it late February, right? It's like February 24 or something is South Carolina.
Yeah, it's going to be a while.
So we've got a bit of a break here where we can stop talking about how Donald Trump is wiping the floor with everyone and is going to win and should win anyway. Sorry.
Now just Nikki Haley.
It's just Nikki Haley, everyone else. But that is an interesting thing. We'll get back to some of those dynamics, but it raises a lot of interesting questions. And we've had one on the horizon for a while we wanted to talk about. It's just taken a while for me and both of us, but me really, to kind of get caught up and make some notes. So we are loaded for bear for a 4-hour podcast today. So buckle up, everybody. No, I'm kidding. It could be, but we won't make it 4 hours.
Yeah, there's definitely enough content here. I mean, every time we read a book, we could go on forever.
You say that, and then I look at my notes and I go, no, there's not. It's just a solid. But no, there really is. In this case, there's a lot going on. There's a lot happening. So before we dive into it, let me remind you, I came loaded. I have copies. He has a book. I have a highlighter. This is serious, people. I have a highlighter. But before we dive into it, let me go ahead and remind you, I'll keep an eye on the chat, first of all, as we are cruising through everything for today. Hopefully we'll have solid audio. You'll hear us really well. Slide into the chats there, YouTube, comments on Facebook, jump over to Rumble if you want to get really spicy, because that's where most fun stuff goes on. Let us know what you're thinking about. I'll keep an eye on it as we're going through. But that reminds me, wherever you are, like, share, and subscribe. If you are on Rumble, big button, YouTube, big red button, turn on the notification bell. Make sure that you are seeing all of our content, because as we have now discussed, we get censored because we talk about some interesting things around here. So if you really don't want to lose touch with us, after you get done sharing, and subscribing and sending the link to a friend so that they can talk about it with you, go on over to philschlafly.com, sign up for the email list. You'll get, after this one today, our links and resources from all the things we talked about, and there'll be a lot today. And then, of course, you will hear from us in the future as well. And we won't abuse that. We'll be nice generally. And then you can also, you've got our email, and you can send personal thoughts and be a lot meaner than out in the chat. Although out there in the chat, it's pretty, they're pretty honest about everything they think. So go and do those things, and then you will not regret it today, I promise. So that's where you go and make sure you get all of the goodies.
Right. Well, yeah. I guess it's a good time to jump in.
It's time. You're the one who brought this topic to the schedule. So why don't you give us a preface? What are we talking about today, Mason?
We are talking about, well, as our loyal viewers will remember, we've read a few books and shared with the audience. Manhood by Josh Paul. The End of by Carrie Gress. And then now we're moving on to not a gender discussion whatsoever. We're discussing the by this book right here. I don't know how in focus it's going to be. Probably not very much.
Hold it and Vanna White this what here.
We can just put it right there. Most importantly, it'll be in the show notes. So if you're interested in what we talk about today, and you think, I might want to learn about this myself, I might want to go read this book and figure it out on my own, then you can do that. But yes, that's the book we're discussing today. And it's an interesting book. The author is a former academic, former Shakespeare professor in the United Kingdom. And Shakespeare scholar, has maybe like 5 books on Shakespeare, I think. I don't know. I haven't read them. I haven't really looked into them. But then he started getting more into economic discourse and wrote a book, The Austrian Economic School.
Right.
And then it has now written 2 books on politics very specifically. There's this one, and then there's a more recent one. But this one I think is very interesting, and it gives lots to think about. So the crux of this book is kind of surveying, I think it's 8 different thinkers who fit into this kind of domain of elite theory, we could call it. And what really the through line with all of them is that there's kind of a hint of Machiavelli in each of them. And I think it's important to touch on that before we jump in, because at least in my experience, Machiavelli was one of the most lied about historical figures through my educational experience. Everybody was like, oh, Machiavelli, yeah, he wrote a handbook on how to be a dictator, and dictators are so bad. Whereas that's not exactly what Machiavelli was writing about. And it took me a while to realize that. And even as I was realizing that, people in my life were like, why are you reading Machiavelli? That guy's a bad guy. No, but that's not the case. What Machiavelli was doing was he was trying to discover a science of politics, to figure out a way to analyze and discuss politics in a very value-free way, rather than having ideological baggage and looking at politics through your ideology. It's okay, let's look at politics as it works in the real world before ideology. And I think that's important to do, because that's a prerequisite to instituting whatever ideology or program that you want. You have to be able to take a sober look at the battlefield before you actually engage in battle. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to win. So that's kind of the basis for where a lot of these thinkers are coming from, looking at politics from a value-free perspective and trying to get a scientific understanding of it, which I think is important for everybody to do, especially if you're going to be working in or commentating on politics.
Right.
But yeah, so a quick list of the 8 thinkers, and we're not going to cover them all today.
And by the way, let me back up and give a definition here. And by the way, if you're experiencing any audio cutouts, do know that we've discovered this is just a terrible time to do this, apparently, because the upload speeds go to nothing. So we may take a poll and ask you all what time of day we should do this outside of the noon hour Central Time, since that's apparently pretty iffy around here. But what elite theory is, what you mentioned as you ran through and just kind of said, let me just give a super quick elite theory, a political science or a theoretical perspective, according to which the country's affairs are best handled by a small minority. And then also in modern societies, this fact is just inevitable. So what it means is there is no such thing as populism. There is no such thing as rule by we the people, the sovereign people, consent of the governed. All of that is really just a myth. It's gone out the window. That's the whole postulation of this. And then you're about to tell us what this book does essentially is compact. And I think I'm reiterating, but for the sake of it, this book compacts several thinkers over the centuries who have put this forward in large form. He is shrinking down to one really pretty easy to read book, saying, here's what they all said, and here's how it kind of ties together and compares to each other. And then he agrees with it, of course. But that's the postulation, essentially. There is no such thing as rule by the people. That's just a myth that makes everyone feel good. It's always a minority of elites that replace. If your elites get gotten and gone, it's another set of elites that comes in and replaces them. So I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Right. Yeah, that's something that's something really interesting. So the 8 thinkers that he talks about are he talks about Mosca, Pareto, and Michels, which he says provide kind of the vocabulary for talking about elites. Then he talks about Carl Schmitt and Bertrand de Juvenal, which I think is a French name, so I'm probably pronouncing it wrong. But he uses their thought to kind of explain how power functions in practice. And then he has 3 more recent and all-American thinkers, James Burnham, Francis, and Paul Gottfried, to talk about the elites today and how the elite structure in America and the West has functions today. And Paul Gottfried is still alive. He runs Chronicles magazine. He's the only character in the book who is still alive. So you can still read what he thinks about today, and he's like publishing new stuff all the time. It's very interesting. But yeah, it's a great way to. This book is a great way to dive into, especially some of these older thinkers like Pareto and Juvenal, where they write these massive poems that you need to get a firm grasp of.
You need a dictionary to make it through a sentence sometimes. It's like, how many big words can we throw together? So it's not exactly in our modern vocabulary what I would call accessible. I mean, it's not unattainable, but it's difficult.
Right. Yeah,
Well, just go ahead. I was just going to get right down to the meat of it. I'm just gonna you finish up.
I think I think it's good to get to the meat of it. Yeah. What do you
so
thinking?
he called this is my favorite thing, because as conservatives we talk about a lot of different topics here. We talk about a lot of different terminologies that are near and dear to our political heart. But what he calls this democratic delusion that he's describing, he says there are 4 liberal delusions, and by liberal delusions he means the classical liberal. Which this is what gets fun when you start to dive into works like this, is you realize, remember here, we're talking about liberalism in the sense of what we now I would say modern call conservatism. We're talking about liberty and free markets and smaller government and less centralized government. That's what we mean by liberalism when this guy says so. But that these tenets, the 4 primary myths, where is it? The 4 primary myths of liberalism that help perpetuate this worldview are the myth of a stateless society, that the state and society were or ever could be separate; the myth of the neutral state, that state and politics were or ever could be separate; the myth of the free market, that state and economy were or ever could be separate; and the myth of the separation of powers, that competing power centers can realistically endure without converging. These basically all of the tenets that we find as modern day conservatives, classical liberals, these main things that we come to, this hypothesizes all of those are garbage. None of them actually exist. You can't have free markets. It's always going to be controlled. You can't have separation of powers. You can't have a separation of society and the state and all these different things. And it's an incredibly pessimistic view. It's an incredibly pessimistic view.
Right.
So, we could go into it, but my question here is, I would just hit you up front. Do you agree with this pessimism?
At some points, I do. I mean, I think that I think it would be good to like add a caveat to some of these, like the myth of the neutral state, or especially like something like the myth of the free market. Like, I think he's correct that there can never be a perfect separation between the market and state, or at least in a way that's like can endure forever. But I do think that like the market and the state can be distinct entities. But I do think it's true that they have a tendency to unite with one another. As business, if 2 people if a politician and a businessman have interests that line up, there will be a tendency for them to want to work together.
Yeah.
And there are ways that we can set up society, like instituting free market legislation or free market parts of the Constitution that can pull back that. But I think he's correct that is the way that the tendency will go.
Okay. I was gonna say I don't necessarily disagree with that. I would say though, just like looking off of this, and I'm trying to not just, because to me this is a lot more simple than this book makes it. And I found we've got a couple of good resources. There's actually someone that we were just looking at recently, Charles Haywood, who he actually had a couple of things, and this is very interesting and balanced view. We've got a couple of stuff there. I'm going to throw those in to the after effects to the after notes, so that you all can take a look at some other people's writing about this book. But what I would tend to say is, I look at it, a lot of the and by the way, it's just you need to speak up. I'm just saying that I'm fine. Just you. No, I'm kidding. No, I mean it is your mic, but just project.
Yeah.
It's from the diaphragm, whatever the opera teacher would tell you.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm not an opera teacher, so I'm not gonna try to go down that road. But what I would tend to say is, the more that I look through all of these, this is democracy an illusion? Yes, it is. They say it's very interesting to me, because I think that there's a lot of analytical correctness. Analyzed a lot of things that happened, and a lot of pieces and parts of history correctly. Honestly, in some of the cases, like what was John? Is it John Burnham or
James Burnham?
James Burnham.
Yeah.
James Burnham. James Burnham. He was accurately assessing something that was right in front of him. But I think as much as there's analytical correctness, I think there is a failure in the ability to predict. Because, I mean, history is just fraught with things happening all over the place that were unexpected, that just erupted out of nowhere.
Right.
And it's kind of disingenuous to look at that and say, well, because this is how it is, I'm accurately depicting the system, this regime, this form of government that we now have, I can predict correctly based on what I'm analyzing, it's just always going to be this way. That to me seems analytically correct and predictively incorrect.
Yeah.
Which I think is just kind of the common problem that I have with this, and why I say a lot of this is right.
Yeah.
But I disagree with it. It's wrong.
Yeah.
So it's this weird world of both. I don't think it's just being optimistic versus being optimistic or idealistic versus being realistic. I'm a realist. I'm not a pessimist.
Yeah.
I'm a realist. So I understand, but at the same time, that's actually not accurate. That is just kind of one of my primary overarching things as I look through this. I don't think we're predicting very well, so much as we're just taking what we see and saying, well, that must be obviously all there is.
Right.
To an extent. I'm oversimplifying a little bit.
Yeah. And I mean, with Burnham specifically, it's interesting because that's one of the big sections. And Burnham wrote The Managerial Revolution, I think, in the middle of the last century. And he also wrote some other books that gained a lot of traction throughout his life. But he was a pretty big conservative figure. But he discussed managerial revolution and that our society is going to undergo a transformation from capitalism to this managerial system, which are distinguished from one another in his view. And he actually came originally from a Marxist perspective. He saw capitalism as not overthrown by the proletariat, but by managers. And what that looks like in practice is, the stuff like BlackRock and the way we don't like it. It would be enduring. Whereas today, I think we're kind of seeing that it does have points of failure. It does have trouble. Especially as we see, planes malfunction more and more. Things like that, where the system doesn't seem to be working as great as it could. The economy is not always progressing, so maybe it's not as enduring as he thought it would be.
Yeah. This may not be a very long one.
Yeah.
Because we're, I feel like we didn't talk about this beforehand, people. Maybe we should have.
Well, I mean,
we should have compared.
I have a lot of stuff in these thinkers that I think would be very interesting to discuss.
Well, let's hit it before we do any kind of wrap up. Let's hit it because I know this is something you spent more time in this book than I have. I powered through it. Let's go because I know that some of these guys, we're talking about things like when you look at this book, he's pulling things together because at least one of these folks is contemporary. What the author in this one does, he actually starts tying into things like UN Agenda 2030 and a bunch of different other things that are very relevant to us right now that we talk about. So there's a lot in there. I mean, go ahead.
He's very thoughtful. I mean, he's writing after the 2020 election, and as an author, he's favorable towards Trump. He's British, but he likes Trump. So he's like, here's how these ideas played out in the last few years. I think that one of the most interesting figures that he covers, and probably one of the most interesting political thinkers generally, is Carl Schmitt. I think that Carl Schmitt's ideas are, once they're not intuitive, and especially with kind of our the way we think about politics, they don't jump out right at us until we read him. And then once we kind of learn about Carl Schmitt, we're like, oh, okay, that can help me look at things totally differently. The two main concepts that come out of Schmitt are in political theology, he writes about the concept of sovereignty, which is the ability to decide on exceptions, and that is like the main political function. And then he also talks about the friend-enemy distinction, I think that was in the concept of the political. And I think the friend-enemy distinction is one of the most important concepts that I think that today our political enemies understand, at least underneath their actions, it seems like they do. Whereas I feel like conservatives struggle to understand that a lot. Which Schmitt's friend-enemy distinction essentially says that in political life, what you should be doing, what a smart and sound and will be successful political actor will be doing, is rewarding your friends and punishing your enemies. And if you're not doing those things, you're not going to be successful. And this is something that a couple weeks ago, I think that Trump identified pretty well, because he was talking about judges and courts, which we kind of talked about yesterday too, with the two-tiered justice system. You hear that a lot, the two-tiered justice system in America. How, the leftists keep getting away with things, and when somebody that the conservatives steps slightly out of line, the hammer just comes down.
Right.
And Trump identified that you said these leftist judges, they're doing everything they can to punish a conservative when they come through. But a conservative judge, their only priority is, having a fair trial. And there's a mismatch there. And and you could even say that the conservative judge has the moral high ground because they're, working in the system as intended, working for fair and free due process. But over the long term, if that continues, what that means is the elimination of conservatism. If they're willing to play by a different set of rules than we are. So yeah, I think that's a very important point that it's good to recognize, because too often I think that we I think that there's this asymmetry between the left and the right, where the left's principles are progress and utopianism, and this kind of like anti-nature standpoint of like, we're going to have continuous liberation of it's going to be this and that, it's going to be gay rights, trans rights, BLM, this and that, liberation to infinity, and that is their goal. Their goal is just to pursue that by whatever means necessary. Whereas I think a lot of conservatives has become not as much to conserve actual tradition and nature, and the things that make Western civilization great, but rather just to conserve the rules. And their principles are the rules and only the rules. And I think that can lead to problems because you're not conserving the principle itself, you're not protecting any sort of principle and further. Rather, you're just focused on, okay, let's just make sure we get the rules right. Well, they're like, screw the rules. We have a political program we're going to institute.
Right. And I think, and honestly, that kind of stepping out of this a little bit and talking a little bit more about something broader, I think that that's an interesting resurgence that we are seeing politically in America between the demographics, particularly age demographics. We are seeing a very interesting switch as these, Generation Z conservatives and below are starting to come up into their own in the political sphere. It's very interesting to see that there's strong return to conservative values, and it's very interesting. It's not just let's do what we've been doing, which is why you see a huge divide between the Nikki Haley supporters and some of these other, we won't even say Trump, just some others, like what she represents, the old guard of the Republican Party 20, 30 years ago versus what people are asking for now, which is a very interesting switch back to, this is welcome to the, welcome to the young language, the trad lifestyle. We're seeing tons of that go around as young people are making radically different choices that actually remind us of 50, 60, 70 years ago, not 20, 30, 40 years ago. So conserving the system is getting thrown out politically. I'm starting to see with younger generations, but instead it's conserving the values that originally got us here, which we're going to go back even farther behind them. That is a very interesting cultural shift that is taking place right now, and it's having massive political ramifications. It's why there is a disruption. I mean, we look from Congress to state legislatures, there is beginning to be a huge disruption inside the Republican Party because there's no unity on the values. There's conserving the system and conserving just what we've done and conserving why we did it that way to begin with. Let's go back and look at that. It's really interesting. I think it's good. I think it's healthy. But it has definitely had some big shockwaves politically, I would say, and there's even more to come. It's just we are seeing the very beginning. I guess I should say shockwaves. We're seeing the very beginning tremors of what I think that is leading to very quickly in the coming 10, 15, 20 years as these younger folks start to vote. And as a lot of the old school conservatives are suddenly not a part of that conservative right-wing voting bloc anymore, that's going to make for a very interesting shift. And I think that partly explains some of the shift of the movement toward the Trump side of the Republican Party and not the traditional side of the Republican Party. So that's, what you're talking about in there, that relates very heavily to something that we see and talk about every single, week, it feels like, with our topic here. So
because it's important that our side of the political aisle has actual principles, and things that we're trying to attain, which is something like preserving Western civilization, preserving the most wonderful and successful civilization in human history. That should be our principle, because I don't think that limited government by itself is a principle on the same level as what I'm talking about, or like what the left does. I think that's a preference of how the political process work, and it could very well be the correct preference. I mean, I do think it lends itself to human flourishing. But I don't think that can be the end all be all of your principles, because in politics, you're therefore only limiting yourself.
Right.
Yeah.
So, someone, by the way, is asking why this guy with his interesting opinions, why does this guy like Trump? I didn't actually go that far into him. Do you have an answer for that? Like what he's talked about that specifically? Is there a short version of that?
Yeah. I mean, he's British, so he doesn't exactly fit in our, like, I wouldn't call him a conservative in the American sense, because
Right.
he's just not an American, and it would be weird to try to like shoehorn him into that category. But I think it's because he overall doesn't like the left and wokeism, and sees Trump as the most optimal way to fight back against that. So,
yeah.
So he's definitely on our side. If he was in America, I think he would vote GOP.
Right, which is why it's just interesting that when I hear, and by the way, if sound off, continue to let us know as I'm looking through all of the technical side while we're still having the discussion, switching some mics and a few different things. So if it gets better or worse, please do sound off and let me know. We've never had a problem for the last 2 weeks, suspiciously, after we talked about Epstein and the CIA. So we'll kind of keep making adjustments on the fly here until we get it back dialed in. But I lost my train. Oh, that's where it's interesting, because it really does come down to, that's why I say pessimism. I think pessimism is the best word for this, because I look at it and I say, it's not that you disagree with our political principles, with our limited government, with what things should be, how they ought to be. You just disagree that we the people can actually do it, that there can be some sort of the people are able to rise up and do this. And he even goes so far as to say that essentially, and correct me if I'm wrong, he goes so far as to say basically, yes, people have opinions, and this, the popular climate, the climate of the people changes, but it's not that the climate of the people ends up driving. By the way, I'm not yelling at you. I switched over to a local microphone just so we know. I'll yell at you later, like, well, there's something else, not this. No, but like the people rising up to something. It's not that drove a different decision making. It's that, you need to change and tinker with something to keep them placated.
Right.
And I mean, again, like, these are things that I feel very much on a regular basis. Like, this is just people throwing the levers here and there to try to keep everyone happy and keep us in charge and keep us in power. But then at the end of the day, I actually believe that there can be enough of a groundswell that it actually leads to change. It leads to something radical, disruptive, eruptive in society that changes things. And this poses that that can't happen. It's never going to happen. It's all, at the end of the day, someone who even hooks in and rides as a vehicle that style, but it's still just an organized minority.
Yeah.
And that's where I want to come in and see what you think here as we get there, because I don't want to go too long. But I would tend to say that there is, I think that rather than these elite forces, these organized minorities adapting to follow public opinion or placate public opinion, I would argue that force actually does follow public opinion. It can, and it does. So I would tend to say that there's a very big difference here between controlled and managed. So, you look at the American Revolution, the War for Independence, obviously this was, it wasn't like an overwhelmingly popular thing. It was pretty divided. There were a lot of folks who didn't want to go the route of independence. It was a laborious thing, but the colonies moved forward in that. Yes, this group of men, the Continental Congress and others, kind of rose up to be the organized minority.
Right.
But that's a leadership necessity, not so much that they were the ones stoking everything and everyone just went along with them. This was a populist idea, but it needed an organized group of people to manage it, because everyone can't manage it. We're not a mobocracy, as the founders called it, this direct 51% rule. That's not functional. It doesn't work that way. So in that regard, I agree with you. There's no way that that's actually what makes the governing decisions. There has to be some sort of system.
Right.
But does the system bow to the wishes of the people, or does the system placate the people and is truly always in charge? That's where it comes down to. I would look at it and say, I agree. It's just, I agree again with the analytics, but we're talking more about managerial control, about managerial administration than we are control. From this minority, this group of elites, and it just is going to roll over from one to the next to the next.
Yeah.
So I kind of look at it and say, you're identifying even correctly that there has to be an organized minority of people that technically throw the levers of power here, but they are responding to the will of the people.
Yeah.
I would even differentiate there, and it's kind of, again, it baffles me to get so much right. Of course, again, he's repeating other thinkers, many of whom I don't actually agree with on a lot of different things.
Yeah.
But it's anyway. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah.
I would tend to make a distinction there that I feel like we just missed that in this idea that's being put forward of elite theory.
Well, force follows public opinion, but what is public opinion? Because public, like, it wasn't the groups in the colonial states. It wasn't the masses who came up with, these new ideas. It was Thomas Paine. It was the Federalist Papers. It was a minority. It was an organized minority, which is the principle he talks about here, that an organized minority will always be a disorganized majority. Force follows public opinion, because at the very least, if you're going to have some sort of armed conflict, you're going to need people with guns and enough of them to stop the other side. But the public opinion will follow the political formulas that a counter elite can come up with, because that's one of the very important terms he talks about in here. A political formula, kind of a justification for why the state and the government are doing the things they are.
Yeah.
The founding myth, so to speak. And I don't mean myth as in untrue, but like myth as in like, kind of our foundational idea as a people that guides us and guides our way of government. So for us, that's our founding myth is the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Those are like foundational ideals. So yes, I agree, but I don't think it starts with public opinion, because I think public opinion has to be manufactured.
Okay. But I don't know if I disagree with that to the point where I would refute it.
I agree completely, because like you do need the majority of the people to be on your side for your system to work.
Right.
That has to be the case. It can't be any other way.
Right.
And maybe it doesn't even have to be the majority. Like I could see our country functioning with like 70% of the country being against the federal government. If those 70% are just like we the people.
Right.
But what they need is what's needed for change, for regime change, is a counter elite to have a new political formula that can mobilize the people.
Right.
So it never starts with the people themselves.
Right. Yeah. That's anything I could say would be splitting hairs from there. So I'm not gonna. That's
I can think of like exceptions to pretty much every step of the way of what I've described, because history is extremely large and complicated. But we're talking about the rule, kind of, not the exceptions.
Right. So I'll back up. I mean, for the most part, I've wrapped up a lot of the things I wanted to cover and say, because this is a very interesting topic. This is one of those that backs up and talks about not just all of the surfacey political things that we deal with today, which is unfortunately in an election a lot of what we get to talk about. What's happening right here, right now, which I say unfortunately. It's not that that's not important. It is. But then to be able to back up and kind of go values debate style, let's keep going deeper. Like, what's the next level?
Right.
What are the fundamental things that we're talking about here? Does that even work? Because if we're, again, if we try to take seriously, whether you believe it's actually real or not, if we the people, by our consent, go different directions in society, it's important for us to not just kind of have a surfacey level opinion about politics. It's important for us to have a pretty notable understanding in some of these things. Now, not everyone has to be a scholar in everything, but I would argue that a lot more people in the past used to have a lot more opinions about a lot deeper topics than we all do now.
Right.
In our Netflix, TikTok world. And I don't think I'm going to stretch too far to say that. So real opportunity for us as conservatives, as people on the right, name you want to give to us. We should have a whole episode sometime on the history of political labels, because holy cow, is it confusing. But those of us on this side of the spectrum, this is important for these discussions to take place. It's a little outside the norm of our modern society. But I want to know not just what my opinion is on this current politician and policy. I want to know what my opinion is about the principles on which it was founded that no one has talked about in a long time. This is kind of a bygone thing. Well, like this, let's back up and examine it from that level. This is a biggie, and it's interesting stuff. It's not the lighthearted conversation you have with your family around the table, but maybe it's time for us all to be diving into discussion groups and study groups again, where we en masse move toward talking about things like this. I think it's important. Let me look at the. Do you have anything to say in closing? Let me look at the.
Yeah, I guess.
Here, see if we're missing anything.
I guess my my closing statement on this is that what this book provides is a look at political science. Like Ryan said, taking a step back, which I think is important because we can get lost in the weeds. So if you're going to fight a battle, you need to know what battle tactics look like and what the battlefield looks like and how to defeat your enemy, which is a non-ideological thing. You can talk about that in completely value-neutral ways. And that's what this book does, which is why, this book, I would say this book doesn't really have his opinions in it because I follow his stuff and he has his opinions, but they really don't show through in this book. This book is just trying to kind of encapsulate scientific truths of how political dynamics function,
Right.
And understanding those is necessary if you want to make things change.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I'm just curious. I mean, because I know that Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals is like a big book on the left. Like Hillary Clinton has talked about it, had that tactics. So I'm curious how much it talks about, like, map on to talking about this. I haven't read it, but I think it's an interesting thought.
Yeah, that is a very interesting thought. Well, there's been a lot of interesting thoughts today, and we've got a lot more. I mean, there's, again, we reviewed, I don't even know. I mean, however long it took us to read the book each and then to make notes and go off and look at other things. There were other interviews and other reviews and different things. I mean, there's hours and hours and hours that went into about a 40-minute discussion. So there is hours and hours and hours for you to do and look at on this topic. Not that you need to do all of them and take them all, but it's stuff like this that is very worthwhile because, I mean, this is how we as a society function and govern ourselves. So we think. So we think, the illusion of governing ourselves. And it is, it's, I see a lot of stuff here in the chat, people talking about Machiavelli never met George Washington. That sounds, by the way, that sounds like a very American t-shirt that I would, Machiavelli never met George Washington.
Yeah.
But no, there's some interesting splits that have happened in history here. And America really does sit. This is a very good reminder that as we look across this and you hear people talking about this, America really is a very small and very relatively new part of the politics and history of the world. And there's an incredible flashpoint of stuff that has happened here that is unique, special, and is worth being a part of. Yeah, even as dark and bleak as it seems when we look around the situation, there's a lot of stuff here that breaks the mold in different ways, and it's important to maintain it and be a part of it. And if there's not a greater clarion call than reading a lot of other people who look across the history of politics, which is much longer than the United States has been in existence, it's kind of an encouraging of, we'll beat that. We're Americans. Like, let's go figure out, like, what are you talking about, and figure out how we need to do things differently. I think there can be a really neat challenge in there. So that's kind of that's at the end of it. That's what I take away. That's my action item. Taking away from this is we are very young, and it so far has been very different and very special from the world over before us. What can we do to not just become the same as everything else and let it all collapse into what others have? Like, we've still got, I feel like there is still an opportunity for some drastic change. And by no means are we too far gone for anything to be changed at this point. Slowly and painfully changed, maybe, but changed nonetheless. So, yeah,
that's all I got.
That's all I've got too.
We'll have lots of links today if you want to learn more about elite theory or this book, stuff like that. Yeah,
absolutely. And I might actually send out a poll in this one too. Talk about a couple different things moving forward. So we'll see. Maybe not this week. Maybe I'll save that. But there's your little teaser. You want to be on the email list if you want to see that, because we're going to get a little bit more interactive here in 2024. We've got plans.
Yeah.
So that's it. Go to the website. Go to social media. Go to the video platforms. Like, share, and subscribe. And know that starting next week, actually maybe even starting this week, we are in fact going to begin releasing this podcast. So exciting. Look at the audio only version. You can get it where all the podcasts are. So if you want to pull it from there, that is going to have a clean feed direct audio version as well. So it will not just be this video pulled. So that's going to start happening. Anyway, there's a lot of new stuff. Go sign up for the emails, phyllisschlafly.com. Send the link to a friend. Have this discussion and tell them that Machiavelli never met George Washington. So we're here to stay.
Happy Black History Month.
That's true. It's February 1st. Happy Black History Month. Is that with the capital B or with a lowercase b?
I think it's capital B according to the AP style.
The AP style says capital B. That's right. Well, if it's the name, proper name, Black History, then it is. I don't disagree with that. We're going to stop before we get shut down entirely and the feed just goes dark. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day. We love you. We appreciate you. And we look forward to another Unauthorized Caucus at noon.